Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can give a critique of Jordan Peterson, not only what we've seen of Jordan on YouTube, but also his interviews and other pieces of work that he's written. So, in this case, of course, Jordan Peterson, in this video, I'm talking about somebody who is real. So just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody, just offering my opinion, just really speculating based on what could be happening in a situation like what we see with Jordan Peterson. So who is Jordan Peterson? Well, he's a clinical psychologist. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. And he's a very productive individual. He has diverse experiences. He's written over 100 papers. He's written books. He's a celebrity more than just what we see like when people become popular on YouTube. He's also a celebrity kind of outside of that. As a matter of fact, when talking about Jordan Peterson, sometimes you hear about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. So he's really kind of taken off in popularity. Now, in one of his videos, he says that his IQ is about 150, which is more than 3 standard deviations above the mean. So he's exceptionally intelligent, if of course that's an accurate IQ. And if you look at his work, it does seem consistent with a fairly high IQ, so I'm willing to believe his IQ is, in fact, that high. Now, part of the reason that Jordan Peterson has become so popular is because he has political opinions that some people are really attracted to and other people are really repulsed by. So I'm going to try to stay away from that whole issue, the whole issue of politics in Jordan Peterson, and focus more on other areas. Now, he's also recorded a number of videos on philosophy, theology, personality theory, specifically the 5-factor model. I remember the model through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism. And of course, he's also a practitioner. He's a psychologist, so he has videos about mental health and certain mental disorders. He also has become more or less a role model for young men. We see with one of his books, he has 12 rules about what young men should do to be successful and more productive. And a lot of these rules kind of make sense. I won't go through all of them, but just a few that kind of stood out to me. He says stand up straight with your shoulders back. So really kind of confidence, kind of building confidence. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. So offering some sense of balance there. We see that he suggests pursuing what's meaningful, not what's expedient. So he's really centered on like a sense of purpose in life. He suggests that people should tell the truth, or at least not lie. Well, it's an interesting way to put it. And he also says that people should assume that the person that they're listening to might know something that they don't, which I think is something that we see in his behavior. And one of my favorites here, the last one I'll mention, is he says that people should be precise in their speech. And this is something I think he really does a lot. This is one of kind of the positive points. So bringing me to some of those positive points, I'm going to talk about positives and negatives here. I'm also going to look at some of the other criticism of Jordan Peterson. So on the positive side, and again, this is just my opinion, I find Jordan Peterson to be bright. He's an excellent public speaker. He's engaging. He's polite. He's a flexible thinker. So there's this idea that when somebody's talking to Jordan Peterson, he's really considering what they're saying and processing that as potential evidence and open to changing his mind, although we don't see him changing his mind a lot during interviews. And I think that he does take the time to find the right words. This goes back to being precise. This is one of his rules. I also find him to be what I call deliberate. Now, deliberate's kind of an unusual construct. It reminds me of the movie Wyatt Earp that had Kevin Costner and Bill Pullman in this particular scene. So Kevin Costner was playing Wyatt Earp and Bill Pullman was playing Ed Masterson. And they're having this discussion about how temperament affects safety in the Wild West. And Wyatt Earp says to Ed Masterson, "You're not a deliberate man. I don't sense that about you. You're too affable." And I think with Jordan Peterson, he is deliberate. I think he is careful and cautious. If we look at certain interviews he's been in, people have tried to trap him, put words in his mouth, and he stops and defends himself. He doesn't just accept their version of what he's saying. He's actually quite careful and, again, precise in his use of language. Now, in talking about some of the people that criticize Jordan Peterson, I've noticed, and this is really just anecdotally, like this is not something I necessarily found in scientific literature or anything, but I find that a number of academics are critics of Jordan Peterson. So he has a PhD, and of course many academics do as well, and that group tends not to be really on board with a lot of what Jordan Peterson has to say. We see that they're critical of the 12 rules. They look at them as simplistic and obvious. Now also anecdotally, I found that certain groups tend to like Jordan Peterson. Like in my experiences, I deal a lot with lawyers and physicians. So these are people who have kind of an applied role. So they learn material theoretically, and then they apply it in their practices. And I found that lawyers and physicians tend to like Jordan Peterson. Now again, there's no scientific research that I'm aware of that supports this. This is just my experience, that academics tend to be critical, and lawyers and physicians tend to like him. So when I read the criticisms, I see that a lot of criticisms of Jordan Peterson seem to be over the top. They kind of accuse him of being dangerous and things like this. I'm unconvinced that his severe critics are on to anything major, but I can understand how somebody would disagree with him in areas of politics, philosophy, theology, and mental health. There is certainly room for criticism here in all these different areas that Jordan Peterson talks about. So of course I've mentioned the areas where I see there's positives, my opinion on the positives. And now I'm going to talk about some of the negatives. I want to make this balanced and look at both sides. Now, with somebody like Jordan Peterson, of course, I could go after the details. I could look at his videos and try to find technical errors. But he's produced so much content that there's always going to be mistakes. I can go back and look at my own videos and find several mistakes. So there's not really much to be gained in that type of criticism. Rather, I'm going to try to touch on a few points that really look more like patterns as opposed to isolated technical errors. So one example here is, I was watching a video of his recently on post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was talking about how individuals who have relationships that end could be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was making some points about conscientiousness and how people try to figure things out and they blame themselves. And I liked a lot of his points, but I kind of got stuck on this idea of his that post-traumatic stress disorder could be diagnosed if somebody had a relationship failure. That isn't one of the qualifying traumas in the definition for post-traumatic stress disorder. So what he's really doing here is he's taking evidence and he's drawing conclusions that extend beyond what can logically be concluded. So there is a definition for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now somebody can dispute that definition and they can say that a relationship failure could be equivalent to that disorder, but technically, of course, that disorder has criteria to it. And if somebody doesn't meet those criteria, they don't have that disorder as it's defined in the DSM. So he's taking liberties here a little bit and really saying that somebody could have post-traumatic stress disorder when, of course, technically they wouldn't in that situation. Not really explaining how he's redefining PTSD in the video. And this is kind of the pattern I've seen a few times. Again, he's taking evidence, he's reading scientific literature, he even conducts original research, but then he's moving just a little too far beyond that to be supported by that evidence. Now, this is fairly normal. I mean, a lot of researchers do this. They take their clinical experience and their opinion, and they put it together with research, and they come up with something new. But he pushes this kind of to the edge. But we have to keep this in perspective, of course. If we look at somebody like Phil McGraw, he calls himself Dr. Phil. Phil McGraw goes way beyond science and his clinical experience and draws conclusions that, in my opinion, much of the time really don't make any sense. But he's doing that for entertainment. Jordan Peterson, I think, pushes things to the edge, but still stays within the learning area, still stays within education. There's still learning value to his videos. So he's edgy enough to make himself interesting, but he still stays within the bounds so that he can be teaching. He can be teaching people about personality and mental health and other areas. So does he push a little too far? I think so. It's not a major criticism. I understand in order to be engaging, you have to take some chances. And I think that's what he does there. Now, in terms of his philosophical lectures, some of these are really complex. And a criticism I'd have in terms of these lectures is that sometimes I'm not sure they mean anything. I mean, I've read a lot about philosophy. I consider myself fairly well versed in it. And I look at some of these lectures and I think, either I'm not smart enough to understand what he's saying, or some of them just don't make sense. Now, it could be that both things are true. I'm always willing to believe I'm not smart enough to understand something, but I'm also willing to believe that somebody can be talking about something and it's not necessarily coherent. It's interesting because with some of these lectures, I'll call people that I know or email them and say, hey, look at this video. I don't really follow this. Is it just me? And a lot of the time, they'll say the same thing. Of course, maybe they're just being nice. Maybe they're thinking that I don't understand it. It's because I'm not smart enough, so they're just too kind to say that. That's always a possibility. But I think a lot of times with his philosophical lectures, they just go so far beyond what can be understood from the literature that he's reading that I just lose track. So it's a minor criticism because he also has a number of really interesting lectures on philosophy that I think by and large I do understand. Now, I think this really kind of speaks to another point, which is sometimes in general, Jordan Peterson is just hard to follow, especially if he makes a reference to something that you haven't read. So a lot of his lectures really require some reading in advance to get the most out of them. Now, I put this in the negative category instead of the positive category, but really I'm not sure it is entirely negative. I mean, he's not featuring every video as an introductory video, and I think that is a major positive. So I listed this under negative, but I think it really could be considered negative and positive. So another criticism here would be specifically where he gets his information from. A lot of the philosophical lectures are based on the works of Carl Jung, and some people look at Carl Jung and immediately they say he's into pseudoscience or he was into pseudoscience. But really, Carl Jung, I think, is more about opinion. He has a lot of opinions. And I think it's okay to talk about Carl Jung and his work, archetypes, and all the other work that he did, and say, look, there's a difference between opinions and science. And I think sometimes Jordan Peterson doesn't make this really clear. But again, when you're watching these lectures, this is something I think people should know. This is philosophy a lot of times and not science. Now looking at some of the other people that have criticized Jordan Peterson, I want to talk about some of their criticisms and how I don't necessarily agree. I'm not trying really here to defend Jordan Peterson, but rather just to be reasonable. So I see criticisms like, if you like evidence and reason, that you shouldn't look at Jordan Peterson. I don't think this is quite fair. I think he is reasonable much of the time, and he does use evidence. And again, I think what they're seeing here is that he adds a lot to it. And I already talked about this as a negative. Some people say that Jordan Peterson has odd mannerisms and he's quite intense. Well, I think that he's just thinking, right? He has a high IQ. He's continually processing information. He seems like he's high in openness to experience. So it makes sense that he would have an intense look because of that thought process. I think people get a little too hung up on how people appear when they talk, so I'm not really worried about this. I'm okay with Jordan Peterson's mannerisms. They make a lot of sense based on what he's talking about and how he's processing kind of in the moment. Now, other people have argued that Jordan Peterson isn't qualified to enter the political arena, that he's not a political scientist. But of course, this is what contributed to him being famous. Well, I don't think this is really necessarily a good quality criticism. Who is qualified to be in the political arena? So now there's educational requirements to have a political opinion? I don't think that's reasonable. I think it's okay if Jordan Peterson wants to talk about politics. I don't always agree with everything he says, but I think he certainly has the right to do it, and he applies philosophy and mental health and personality to his political discussions, and he is an expert in those areas. So I think it's fair of him to add politics to what he's talking about. He's integrating a lot of different topics, and that's okay with me. Another criticism I hear the people make of him is that he's ambiguous, murky, and all over the place. So he's unfocused in his overall effort, but not necessarily unfocused in specific moments. Well, he produces a lot of work. There's a lot of diversity in his work. So this is the natural consequence of that. If you're interested in theology and philosophy and mental health and personality and politics, of course your work is going to seem unfocused at some level because those are different disciplines. So, again, I understand the criticism here of Jordan Peterson, but I don't think this is really necessarily fair. Now, the last criticism that I'll talk about here, and I hear this one a lot about Jordan Peterson, is that you can't be knowledgeable about everything. So this one's essentially saying that he's just taken on too much, and it's similar to the unfocused argument. Jordan Peterson is exceptionally bright. I mean, if you look at his discussions of these topics, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that he's thought about them a lot, and he comes up with interesting conclusions. Again, somebody may disagree with the conclusions, but that doesn't mean that Jordan Peterson isn't smart or intelligent or knowledgeable. So is it true that you can't be good at everything? Yes, I've said that before in prior videos about other subject matters. But I think Jordan Peterson does an okay job staying within the domains that he's talked about. Yes, he doesn't have a PhD in these areas except for one, which of course would be the mental health component and the personality. I mean, psychology covers both of those pretty well. But I do think that he does a fairly good job reading and exploring these topics. And again, he's interesting and engaging, so I don't find that criticism to be one of the better, more valid criticisms against Jordan Peterson. So I know whenever I talk about controversial figures, and certainly Jordan Peterson would qualify as a controversial figure, there are going to be different opinions. There will be people that agree and disagree with me. There will be people that agree and disagree with Jordan Peterson. If you have opinions in this area, please put them in the comments. I'm hopeful this will generate an interesting discussion. As always, I hope you found this critique of the work of Jordan Peterson to be interesting. Thanks for watching.